Well, welcome to our session this afternoon. A nation indivisible, military, economic, and cultural connections during the Greater Reconstruction. We've got a full crew, as you can see here, of presenters and commentators. My name is Elliot West of the University of Arkansas. The original program showed Robert Chester as chair and myself as commentator, and it showed the program as a series of papers. All of that's wrong. I will be the chair. Robert will be a commentator as well as giving some of his own comments of his own work. And because we've got, after all, several papers here, rather than giving the full papers, what we're going to do is each of the participants will speak for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will open it up to discussion and make it more of a round table. What I'd like to do at the beginning is just to introduce everyone at once to get that out of the way, and then they will be presenting in the order that they are that I introduce them in the order that they are in the program here. Up first is Rob Voss. He is currently at the where are you now, Robert?
At Northwest Missouri State.
Northwest Missouri State, assistant professor at Northwest Missouri State University. Mm-hmm. He received his PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he worked under Will Thomas and John Wunder. His dissertation is Railroads and Coal, Natural Resource Extraction in the Indian Territory, 1866 to 1907. The title of the paper in the program is Iron Horses, Indigenous Crossroads, Railroads, Resources, and Sovereignty in Indian Territory. Next will be Catharine Franklin. Catharine is currently a lecturer at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, but as of fall of 2015, is that right? Mm-hmm. She will be a new assistant professor at Texas Tech University. In the meantime, she has a 9-month fellowship at the Huntington Library, quite a plum. So congratulations is due to her. She received her PhD at the University of Oklahoma in 2010. She has published in Montana Magazine and Southwestern Historical Quarterly. Her article in Montana Magazine, Black Hills and Bloodshed, the U.S. Army and the Invasion of Lakota Land, won the Vivian Paladin Award. That's the award given every year for the best article in the journal. An award I both agreed heartily with and voted for. Mm-hmm. So it's a very fine article if you have a chance to read it. She has a book in progress, The Army Stands Between, the United States Army, Federal Indian Policy, and Native Sovereignty, 1862 to 1902, under contract with Nebraska. Next will be Jennifer Brown. Jennifer is currently assistant professor at Texas A&M University at Corpus Christi. She received her doctorate at Washington State University at Pullman. She also has published in Montana, the Magazine of Western History, and in the Western Historical Quarterly, and in Pacific Northwest Quarterly, three excellent journals. Her presentation will be Officer Sportsman, Fish Conservation, and Environmental Change in the Rocky Mountain West. And I should mention that Catharine's paper or presentation will be Frontier Sharpers and Satrap Authorities, great title, United States Army and National Consolidation, 1865 to 78. Mark Long will be our next presenter. Mark is a lecturer at University of Central Florida. He received his PhD from Loyola University in Chicago. I learned at lunch that he's a former wilderness guide, very impressive. And he also has delivered one of the more interesting conference paper topics I've ever seen, titled Wasted Away in Margaritaville, Jimmy Buffett's Narrative of the Greater Caribbean. You can't beat that. His topic is The New Order of Things, Jacksonville's Maritime Nexus, and the Settling of the Florida Peninsula. Our commentary will be by Robert Chester. Robert is currently a lecturer visiting lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley. He received his doctorate at the University of California, Davis. He is published in environmental history and has an essay in the forthcoming book with the University of California Press, Consequences of the Comstock, the Remaking of the Working Environments of America's Largest Silver Strike, 1859 to 1880. So we have several very fine young historians today, and I will turn it over first to Robert Voss to give his presentation.
All right. Good afternoon. make sure this microphone is working. All right, so today I would like us to consider the greater meanings of Reconstruction, and that's what all of us are tackling, and what it encompassed. In 1866, the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek or Muskogee, and Seminole, of what would become Oklahoma, signed new treaties following the conclusion of the Civil War. This drastically reconfigured their relationship with the rest of the United States. And what I'd like to focus on is the relationship of railroads to this place, because each of those 1866 treaties included a line or several lines regarding giving permission to a railroad to cross, or one railroad to cross from north to south and a different railroad to cross from east to west through each of the 5 respective civilized tribes. Unfortunately, those railroads, or those tribal nations, did not meet up. And an east to west railroad in the Cherokee Nation would not match up to an east to west railroad in the Choctaw Nation, or the Creek Nation, or any of the others. And this is a complicated narrative, a complicated story. So while the surrounding states contained hundreds of miles of track, the Indian Territory, part of the region that would become Oklahoma, remained void of railroad tracks until 1870. Once railroad building was introduced in the Indian Territory, it grew relatively slowly, so that in 1880, the Indian Territory had only 273 miles of track compared to 3,000 miles of track in Texas and over 3,000 miles of track in Kansas, at least 850 miles in Arkansas. Again, by 1882, the Indian Territory had only 4 railroad companies, compared to over 103 in Kansas that same year. And while looking at period maps of the U.S. in the late 1800s, one finds an Oklahoma-shaped hole in the middle of the map, regularly labeled unorganized territory. Some maps make it appear that this area has no population and suggest that it has no formal identity. And so my question is, why did this central region lack one of the most important technological advancements in the 19th century? So this area west of the state of Arkansas, north of Texas, part of the Louisiana Purchase, had a long history in Euro-American records as part of Indian country, or the Indian Territory. Before the Louisiana Purchase, this place was the middle ground between Spanish Texas and French Louisiana. Both nations claimed the land, but it was so far inland and away from other Euro-American settlements that neither the French nor the Spanish settled the land and was unintentionally reserved for indigenous populations. The area remained separated by large distances from other Euro-American settlements for most of the 19th century. As the United States claimed increasingly large swaths of North America, this area remained apart from white settlement. And one can consider this area, as referred to as the Indian Territory or the Indian Country, as part of the West, as what Walter Nugent defined as a place that shares a history of conquest and the mixing of ethnically diverse peoples in a land whose economic identity derives primarily from limited opportunities. So at one point, it's part of the West, and yet people in the region owned slaves. They grew cotton, and the Confederacy lay claim to it as a 12th state. In these ways, the Indian Territory was a southern region. Considered broadly, the Indian Territory functioned in the 19th century as an important peripheral subregion of both the Old South and the New West, and yet it was bound to the east through that steel ribbon of the railroad. So this region was going to be the 12th state of the Confederacy, according to treaties signed in 1861 following federal removal of troops from the region. Plantations worked by African American slaves dotted the landscape. And this is part of why that region needs to be considered when discussing greater Reconstruction. So if the region is part of the South and subject to the definition of Reconstruction, then what was reconstructed? So the issue of Reconstruction was the relationship of the region to the rest of the United States. The area was tied in this Reconstruction era incorporated into the rest of the United States. This happened through the development of 2 things: railroads and coal mines, bringing capital and outsiders into a region that previously had little of either, in an attempt to open the region to full integration into the United States. The reconstruction of Indian Territory brought capitalism to the area through these 2 avenues of coal mines and railroads. So these 2 industries intersecting in the Indian Territory did not force their way into the region. Instead, there was an incredible amount of discussion over railroads and the Indian Territory. Beginning in the 1850s, Native Americans, including Peter Pitchlynn, a Choctaw delegate, appealed to the government to justify the need for industry, asking the federal government to allow coal mines and to allow especially railroads to come in. He appealed, quote, "Our progress is too slow and we are almost disheartened. But let our affairs with the government be properly and kindly adjusted. Let only simple justice be done for us. Give us railroads." He wanted the most obvious sign of progress that was available. And despite this appeal, no railroads accepted the request. But this is also not to say that the demand for railroads and industry was universal. Chief John Ross of the Cherokee protested the ways that the Cherokee were threatened by Kansas railroads. The governor of Kansas dismissed the power of Indian treaties. And maybe it's unsurprising then that when a railroad, an early version of the Union Pacific Southern Branch, applied for a right-of-way through the Cherokee Nation, that the Office of Indian Affairs denied the request. So railroads did not cross the region following the new treaties of railroads did cross the region following the treaties of 1866. Signed by all 5 of the civilized tribes, these treaties opened the way for railroads. The Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railway and the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, the two first railroads to cross the region, each lobbied successfully for the access, linking this area and the rest of the continent. Despite gaining access, the respective Native American nations continued to hold the property. Contrary to the situations in other regions, the Native Americans of the 5 civilized tribes owned the title to their land in fee simple, the legal terminology. So the tribe collectively owned the land, compared to the right of usage that other Native American groups claimed and that the Supreme Court recognized. The situation of land access proved surprisingly complicated. The railroad managers, while planning on gaining access to Native American land, at first expected it to be very easy. While the railroads tried to manage the Indians, Native American leaders in Indian Territory were not purely oppositional to railroads. Rather, they primarily sought control over their respective lands and negotiated with others in power to those ends. Land control was a primary objective for Native American leaders when dealing with railroads, even if they could not totally restrict movement across their space. The Atlantic and Pacific Railroad's charter gave 20 square miles of land in alternating sections for each mile of track built within a territory. Compare that to the Union Pacific that built across Nebraska, which gained 10 square miles of track in alternating sections when they built through the West. So this was twice as much as the railroads stood to gain building the Transcontinental Railroad. The company, the Atlantic and Pacific, would be able to determine the best route and building the railroad the way they wanted to while taking material along the way, all the way to the coal. A similar situation existed for the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, which carefully planned their route through coal outcroppings. Over the next 15 years, both railroads gained coal access. The Missouri-Kansas-Texas worked with Native Americans to lease the region and to develop coal mines. These mines were operated by the railroad in conjunction with Native Americans. They were worked by white miners in the region with explicit permission by the respective Native Americans. The intention was to mine the coal and export it to the respective railroads, providing significant cost savings for the railroad while bringing wealth to Native Americans. The thinking went that if the Native Americans were drawn to the wealth offered by railroads and the coal mines, they would be willing to become fully integrated into the United States. Of course, this did not happen cleanly as was hoped. Instead, railroads and their coal mines became embroiled in taxation and rights. Congress accepted many subsequent railroad applications for the Indian Territory, and so a second group of railroads further established coal mines and systems of capital in the region, including developing railroad stations and importing coal miners. Edwin Ludlow efficiently managed the mines for all of Indian Territory. However, the miners themselves were not satisfied. Pulled into the territory with the promise of steady work and decent pay, the coal miners resisted a pay reduction that came in May of 1894. And I will end with this. That spring, like most of America's coal mines, the mines of Indian Territory went on strike. In this instance, here is a clear intersection of capital and railroads. The strikers resisted this pay cut imposed by railroads and the mine owners. When the miners struck, the Indians, especially the Choctaw, evicted the striking miners from the territory and brought in scab workers. So in this clear instance, Native Americans were acting as capitalists by protecting their economic interests when they were threatened. So in the summer of 1894, there is this triumph of Greater Reconstruction, the success of Greater Reconstruction, as Native Americans, at least some, accepted the capitalist vision and acted on it. Thank you.
Contrary to popular belief, the expansion of federal authority in the form of the U.S. Army was not a matter of simple conquest in the West, nor was it particularly easy in the Reconstruction South, and my remarks today will explore this topic in brief. In the 1860s and 70s, the extension of federal authority throughout the West and the recently conquered South were intimately related. Army officers served as agents of national consolidation in regions where civil and federal authority had yet to assert itself in full. Their experiences demonstrate the difficulty of expanding federal power. Writing of the Army's role in labor disturbances in the late 19th century, Jerry Cooper has remarked that officers were, quote, left to their own devices to interpret and carry out the vaguely defined intents of both presidential and congressional policy, unquote. The same could be said for the Reconstruction South and the American West. Testifying to the Joint Committee on Reconstruction in 1866, Army officers made it clear that many Southerners were bitterly hostile toward federal troops. Colonel David S. Stanley, serving in Texas, told commissioners, "I witnessed insolence and disgraceful conduct toward officers who were passing through the country. I had hard work on one occasion from restraining my staff officers from shooting some of these fellows." Colonel Benjamin H. Grierson, famous raid in 1863 through Mississippi, he served throughout the South in several different states, and he told committee members, "Instead of growing more willing to accept the situation, white Southerners are showing a more intense feeling of bitterness toward the government. They do not appear to think that they have done anything wrong." Brevet Major General George Armstrong Custer, serving in Texas with the 7th Cavalry Regiment, made similar observations. He said he'd encountered civilians whose conversation was generally of the most insulting character, being abusive of the federal government and strongly opposed to the Army. In Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and other parts of the South, this animosity often turned physical, as white Southerners assaulted and even killed, on many occasions, white Army officers and black soldiers. When they served on the plains a few years later, every single one of these officers who I've mentioned found themselves standing between Anglo-American civilians and native peoples, just as they had stood in between unrepentant Southerners and freedmen. In Dakota Territory, Colonel Stanley fumed about the selfish and unprincipled rascals who flocked to the Black Hills in search of gold. He wrote, "The frontier papers scream over it, and regardless of law, call for thousands to come and spend their money at their taverns and buy outfits at their shops, and invade a reserve the general government is pledged to defend for the Indians." Stanley also denounced the dishonest contractors and Indian agents who conspired to defraud the Office of Indian Affairs. By stealing rations and annuities meant for Indians, these frontier sharpers, as he called them, made it more difficult for Army officers to convince Native peoples to remain on reservations and at peace with whites. And many people tend to forget that Army officers well through 1870 served as Indian agents, and were in fact many of them respected by Native peoples. Before the passage of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, Army officers acting in law enforcement roles were concerned about their legal standing. During his tenure in the South, Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry told Major General William Tecumseh Sherman that he could do little more than give support to the civil authorities and move detachments of troops. Terry added, "I have endeavored to take no action which could not be justified by the letter of the law." And it's crucial to remember that Terry served as a lawyer and worked in New Haven as a clerk of the court before the Civil War. Federal guidelines remained vague in the decades after that conflict, meaning that officers had to interpret their responsibilities in the absence of explicit orders. Western newspapers called Army officers bullies and tyrants, but officers sometimes found themselves at the mercy of civil authorities. The former had good reason to act with caution. They were not immune to lawsuits or arrest, as the case of John Gordon makes clear. Gordon was the leader of a particularly infamous band of illegal prospectors who went into the Black Hills time and time again. Thanks to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, the Black Hills and surrounding areas are set aside for the Lakota people. The Army is pledged to defend that land for them, and the Army does that pretty well through the winter of 1875 until they're forced by the federal government, the executive office, to withdraw from that area. So it's a matter of Army officers keeping whites from invading Lakota land. Gordon, again, this leader of this band of illegal prospectors, he's arrested by the Army. He gets into a scuffle with an Army officer and his enlisted clerks. He then convinces the civil authorities in Dakota Territory to arrest that officer and his men. He then sued the officer for assault and battery and false imprisonment. When Army officers in Dakota Territory received orders from General Philip Henry Sheridan to burn the wagon trains, destroy the outfits, and arrest the leaders of these illegal mining parties, civilians were furious. Most Army officers had limited authority to enforce these orders or any orders in the Black Hills. This meant that General Terry, who commanded all of the military personnel in Dakota Territory, had to ask his superiors time and again whether he was actually allowed, legally permitted, to drive miners off Indian lands. Another incident in the Black Hills sheds light on the precarious nature of the Army's interactions with civilians. When an Army officer arrested a group of illegal miners, those prospectors retaliated by telling civil authorities that the Army officer had harassed them, burned their belongings, and stood idly by while his men rifled through their pockets. Regional newspapers believed this lie, and they came to the miners' defense, calling the incident an outrage and denouncing the Army. One paper insisted that the officer and, quote, his command should be drummed out of the Army in disgrace and then turned over to the Nebraska laws and dealt with severely. A district court upheld the Army's legal right to evict trespassers, but they limited the length of arrest to some 5 or 7 days, thus rendering the Army's power much less effective. In Texas, the same story. Recalcitrant civilians accused Colonel Grierson, commanding Fort Sill in Indian Territory, of conniving at the depredations of the Indians. Reconstruction Texans, whites that is, would not have liked Grierson because his regiment was the 10th Cavalry, composed entirely of black enlisted men and their white officers. Civilians howled that Grierson was one of the satrap authorities bent on abusing them, and the editor of one Austin newspaper bragged, "One company of cowboys will kill more Indians and protect more property than 1,000 regulars, whose line officers are just from West Point." Texans saw Grierson and his protection of Kiowa and Comanche Indians as a reaffirmation of Northern tyranny and an attack on white privilege. These are just a few of the instances in which Army officers found themselves at odds with Anglo-American civilians in the South and West. Archival evidence reveals that, at times, Army officers exhibited a marked inability to control Anglo-Americans who were determined to resist federal laws. Careful study of the Army's unpublished correspondence shows us that, in a surprising number of places throughout the West, the Army's success was contingent and even limited. While historians have done much to deepen our understanding of the Army in the West and the South, the notion persists that the military's operations, as Karen Merrill put it, are so clearly, so obviously instances of a powerful state at work. The examples that I've mentioned here today are instructive in this regard, for they demonstrate that the Army was at times far less than omnipotent. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. Focusing on the fishing and the military today, my own research illustrates the connections between empire, leisure, and conservation in the territorial Rockies. And it also shows the growth of the size and the power of the state during Greater Reconstruction and the roles of that state in the West and in the South, I suppose, as well. It comes from a larger project examining over a century of environmental and social change that eventually creates a Rocky Mountains known for fly fishing and known for non-native trout. And in this larger work, two central themes kind of drive the narrative. The first part is how imperialism and transnational processes kind of remake the environments and landscapes in smaller regions. And then secondly, I'm really fascinated by the ways in which kind of people construct places over time and the environmental and social consequences of these new places. In researching this larger history, I found that in the West, agents of empire proved to be zealous anglers. And naturalizing leisure and the sport of fishing became part of westward expansion. The officer sportsmen, as well as the enlisted men, stationed at Western garrisons fished enthusiastically during and after the territorial period, and regulars enjoyed fishing for sport, food, and the spirited rivalry near outposts and on long marches. Elite officers, however, appeared more likely to contribute to national sporting periodicals like Forest and Stream on Western aspects of fish life and natural history, angling methods, as well as conservation. And some of the first regional boosters, they extolled fishing and hunting opportunities in the Rockies. And for instance, sportsman and bird collector Major Charles Bendire routinely shared his experiences with an Eastern audience while stationed at various posts throughout the West. During the Bannock War of 1878, Bendire traveled through central Idaho and the headwaters of the Salmon River. Saying remarkably little about the war itself, and this is a theme that comes up in all of these officer sportsmen's writings, is they're not talking about the military, they're talking about fishing and hunting. Bendire describes the region in terms of its sporting prospects, saying that that area was, quote, a sportsman's paradise. And from the view of Bendire and many of the other officers who promoted Western sport, the region offered virgin sporting opportunities with no apparent competition from the native inhabitants. Their writings helped popularize the Rocky Mountains as a place for play and a tourist destination. Now, officer sportsmen's roles in promoting Western fishing also went beyond boosterism. Conquest brought about environmental change and the introductions of non-native trout. Not surprisingly, as enthusiastic anglers and Western boosters, they're also involved in promoting Western fish culture. One of the earliest Montana trout plantings took place near Fort Assiniboine when soldiers reportedly stocked Beaver Creek, a favorite destination for them and their families to go on picnic and camping outings. In Yellowstone National Park, angler and acting superintendent Captain Fraser Boutelle, he basically made it his personal goal and responsibility to develop fish culture there. And he invited the U.S. Fish Commission in to visit the park, conduct scientific studies, and introduce non-native trout. And in the park, Yellowstone, 40% of the park's waters did not originally contain fish. And these trout introductions led to more fishing opportunities for tourists. As enforcers of a federal Indian policy aimed at dispossessing and assimilating Native Americans, the Western military presence opened the door for settlement, environmental change, and new ways of viewing nature through the lens of leisure. Now, to add on to this, when we talk about Reconstruction, we talk about greater Reconstruction. It's often we're telling national stories in many ways, but I'd like to kind of add just briefly about how all of this I've been talking about of fishing, conservation, and the role of the state has a very much kind of transnational element to it. And the ideas of sport and conservation come largely from a transatlantic exchange, particularly between American anglers and British anglers with that. And the rise of sport and leisure itself is dependent upon the growth of industrial capitalism worldwide. And then this sport, this leisure, becomes spread through empires. So you see that in the West, you see that in places like India, New Zealand, throughout the world. And the fish, these new species that they're bringing to these places, also come from transnational exchanges. And the U.S. Fish Commission was busy with that, particularly under the leadership of Spencer Bard. He's making connections to German anglers, to British anglers, and what you have are various distinct species of trout being brought to places throughout the world with that. But with all that said, however, empires really showing kind of the fissures in the power of that growing state, they had problems reimagining angling as a sport, because angling is defined by fishing with a hook and a line. And it's a simple gear requirement. And it's a way to catch food that has been used by many cultures for millennia. I think the world's oldest fish hook was recently found from Southeast Asia and is 42,000 years old. So angling has existed before writing and civilizations for that. So when these sportsmen, they're upholding angling as sport, what they're doing is upholding a way of catching food that's used by many people. So as such, it could never be controlled and managed in the ways that many of these agents of empires had imagined for the sport, kind of showing those fractures in the growing power of the state during Greater Reconstruction. Thank you.
I too thank you for coming out. So I'm going to move our attention dramatically to the east, I think. And my work is on Florida, and specifically the post-Civil War period, and I guess maybe because of my past career as a wilderness guide, I've decided to sort of use a narrative hook of 3 different boat trips on the St. Johns River to try and sort of get at this sort of moving narrative that I'm working with. And the first begins in the winter of 1865, when a resident from Florida who had fled the state after secession returned. He bought a sailboat and sailed up the St. Johns River to sort of assess what had happened during the war. Let me interrupt myself and I find some people don't know Florida very well geographically. So Jacksonville sits in the northeast corner, and it sits in the corner of the St. Johns River, which flows from the Atlantic and curves south at Jacksonville and heads basically directly into the peninsula. So that's the sort of area that I'm concerned with. So he sailed up the St. Johns River. He finds that Jacksonville is, in his words, in ruins. The city had been burned twice, once by retreating Confederate troops and then later by retreating Union troops, who then reoccupied and controlled it for the rest of the war. The whole place was a scene of devastation and sorrow, he said. He ventured upriver, which is going south, and found that the whole area of the St. John's Valley to be itself uninhabited wilderness, he said. Right. So this is the template in 1865. We have a place that's sparsely populated at best south of Jacksonville. In 1860, there's about 1,200 people. So it is sparsely populated, and it is now at the end of the war, obviously ready and open for reconstruction and for development, and that's the sort of story that I'm tracing is what is it that structures the development in this part of Central Florida in this period. The port of Jacksonville is returned to civilian authorities in the summer of 1865, and there's much celebration and many huzzahs in Jacksonville about this, because Jacksonville is functionally, if not technically, an island at this point. Its only contact with the outside world is the maritime contact. It is hemmed in on the north and the west from the St. Johns River, and to the east by the Atlantic Ocean, and to the south there is territory, there's terrestrial areas, but there's virtually no one there, and so their connection is a maritime connection, and that's that sort of nexus of the maritime world that I'm trying to sort of work through in my own work. When the port opens, the newspaper celebrates this, of course, and says that we need to make the port look nice, quote, for those who come south with capital to invest. They're very eager to link quickly with the north. They see that as the sort of the future of their city and their area. And very quickly, the port is alive with maritime traffic. Ships, within 2 weeks, there are ships, 7 ships that have cleared the bar at the St. John's, which is a tricky bar and a constant problem. And throughout 1865 and 66, there are routinely 8 to 10 ships a week coming into port and leaving port. And they come from all over. The most frequent port of destination is New York, and followed closely behind by Savannah. But beyond that, there are ships in from Boston, Havana, Nassau, Hilton Head, New Bedford, Puerto Rico, from Jamaica, from Richmond, Virginia, So it is a port that even in its first year of operation or reoperation is connected with a much broader sense of space than we would expect for a place that's sort of landlocked, if you will. And I think one of the things that I'm particularly interested in getting at is the way in which the sort of maritime nexus challenges our traditional notions of space, right? We tend to think of space as being sort of a terrestrial, oftentimes a terrestrial sort of entity, and once you're on water, you're free in many cases to, in this case, the entire North Atlantic rim becomes a significant part of the world that begins to structure this development. So a second trip is in May of 1871, and a steamboat steams past Jacksonville and up the St. Johns River, about 200 miles upriver, to a little town called Mellonville, which was a fort from the Second Seminole War. A handful of people lived there at the time. And off of this ship stepped 32 new Swedish immigrants, who I'm sure were stunned by the heat and humidity in Florida in May, having just left New Uppsala, a couple of weeks ago. They're there because the year before, another man had made a trip on a steamboat to the area, and his name was Henry Sanford. And Henry Sanford was a wealthy son of a manufacturer from Connecticut who was a career diplomat. He was serving at King Leopold's court in Belgium, spent his entire diplomatic career in Belgium, later involved in the colonization of the Congo. He was so smitten with Florida, he bought 12,000 acres and began to create a development scheme based on tourism, and citrus and real estate. And he built large, basically a citrus latifundia, if you will, in Florida. But mostly what he wants to do is sell land. So he builds 2 hotels in the town named after himself of Sanford, Florida, which you may have heard about in the last couple of years because of some ugliness. But and begins to partition and sell land. He founds eventually the Florida Land and Colonization Company, which is basically a collective endeavor to gather investors from Europe, which he does. A lot of investors from England in particular are investing in the area. And so even 200 miles upriver, because it is part of the Jacksonville port nexus, this little town of Mellonville and later Sanford is connected to this broader maritime trade routes. Significantly, there is a great deal of resource extractions at sometimes the most basic levels. As tourists went west in trains, we know they shot buffaloes. Well, in Florida, they shot alligators from steamboats, the same process. There were locals who would then skin those gators. One of them bragged that he could peel the bark off a gator in 7 minutes. He would sell those skins to a buyer in Jacksonville, who would then sell them to a buyer in London, and they became part of the European fashion industry, right? So there's already this deep, sort of interpenetration of the world markets into this, still sort of unsettled place or settling place. Bird plumes the same way. Bird populations are devastated in this period. Citrus is, I should hasten to point out, is a capital-intensive form of agriculture. I mean, it doesn't take necessarily a lot of land individually. The story they were selling was that 5 acres could provide you a comfortable living for the rest of your life. But there is what was known colloquially as the long, hungry gap, and that is it's at least 5 to 7 years from planting to your first commercial harvest. So you have to have the capital necessary to survive that period. And so these are not hardscrabble frontier farmers, right? These are in many cases gentlemen farmers. Culturally they saw themselves as different from the cracker farmers who came before them. Many of them former Union officers or soldiers who had been stationed in Florida and returned very quickly to leave the snows of their native Wisconsin or Michigan or wherever they were from. Third trip, fast forward to 1883. In April of 1883, yet another steamboat plying the waters of the St. Johns comes into the now bustling town of Sanford. On it is the sitting President of the United States, Chester Arthur, and he is on a fishing trip. He's an avid angler. He brings with him his Secretary of Navy, William Chandler, for an extended trip in Florida, mostly to fish and to see the exotic wilds. He had been in some ways brought there by Henry Sanford, who was working, trying to get Chester Arthur to sort of sign off on what Belgium is doing in the Congo. So this is part of a larger project. With Chester Arthur comes, of course, a multitude of reporters from the national press. The New York Times covers the trip extensively. They report in many ways in glowing terms about Florida, about the climate, about the scenery, about the sporting opportunities for field and stream. And they speak glowingly of Sanford in particular. So give a sense of the place that Chester Arthur is stepping into, right? It has, in really 15 years, has transitioned from a town that has a handful of settlers to a town of around 3,100 people. So there's a pretty significant sort of boom in population. It is a sort of, in some ways, a classic mushroom town. But importantly, 15% of that population is foreign-born. 20% of it is born in the north, 65% in the south, but most of those are native Floridians. And so unlike much of the rest of the South, what's being constructed on the banks of the St. Johns River, I would suggest because of this maritime, the maritime trade, the circulation of goods and capital and people, is a cosmopolitan town, would-be city, that is not representative of the kinds of political and economic transitions that are happening in the rest of the South, right? So it stands in some ways as a special case. I won't go. I have a bunch of statistics on development, farm valuations, et cetera. I won't bore you with those now, but I will say that the other thing that's, I think, significantly important about this place and time is that not only is the foreign population significantly larger, the rest of the South, if we exclude Texas, which has a significant growth in foreign-born population in this period, but the rest of the South experiences a net loss, about a 2% net loss in foreign population. So Sanford is running considerably against the regional trend in terms of its foreign-born population. People from England, Ireland, Scotland, France, Russia, Poland, Sweden, Luxembourg, Hungary, Holland, Bermuda, Norway, Austria, Brazil, and Belgium are enumerated on the census rolls. So there's also a significant increase in the population of African Americans, and this is at a time when the state of Florida itself is losing, not in total numbers, but as a percentage of population, it's becoming sort of a larger white population. Sanford's going the opposite direction, from 11% to 37% in the course of these decades, and I think the reason for that is that there is a vibrant economy in play that is overwhelmingly wage-based. Right? These are jobs that pay cash. African Americans have a higher percentage of farm ownership than they do elsewhere in the state and in the South. They also have a much lower percentage of farming as an occupation, which I think is telling. Only 8% of the African Americans in the area are actually farming, because there are urban jobs to be had in hotels, commercial fishing on the St. Johns River, et cetera. And so there is, I think, this sort of the way in which the economy has been structured. There is, without question, a kind of an international context that is, I think, possible only because it is cut off from its terrestrial, the rest of the area, right? Because of its maritime. There is a declension to this, right? That over time the railroads come through, and the population begins to mirror the South in many other ways. It's southernized in a sense in the early 20th century as a result. And so I guess I think I'm done, right? So my time is up. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm going to try to pare down my presentation of my own stuff. It's come in under 10 minutes. It's probably about 8.5 to 9 minutes. And that leaves me a little time when I'm done with that to just briefly kind of wrap all these things together. So I'm hoping to do that as well. So I'm going to take my watch off, because otherwise I won't look at it. Thanks for attending the session. I'd like to thank the panelists for participating in the session. I would also like to thank Elliot especially, both for agreeing to chair the roundtable and for providing the conceptual and creative inspiration for our discussion today. The first time I saw Professor West speak was at the OAH in San Jose during a panel honoring the work of the esteemed historian of the American West, Howard Lamar. In his presentation, Elliot emphasized the conceptual clarity facilitated by Lamar's accessible prose and sharp analytic focus. Of course, these same virtues are also what make Elliot's own work so approachable, insightful, and usable. In addition to being an excellent historian, his wit, empathy, and talents as a first-rate yarn spinner also serve to enhance the appeal of his work. Professor West's call to reintegrate the American West into the national story of what he has termed a greater Reconstruction has been a welcome rallying cry to those of us working on the transformative changes that reconfigured the country in the second half of the 19th century. His work has focused our attention on the questions raised by rapid national expansion and how the answers to those questions emerged in distinct but related ways in the South and the West. In my own work on the social, economic, and environmental history of the Comstock Lode, I have found his arguments heartening given my repeated encounters with those working on the eastern half of the United States who seem to prefer reasons to split the regions apart rather than lump them together. Ultimately, the vast majority of larger structural forces transforming the United States during the mid-19th century remade the West too. I'd like to read a sentence from Professor West's 2003 presidential address to the Western History Association. Quote, "From Virginia plantations to Nevada mines and Nebraska homesteads, the nation would be pulled together under the ideals of free labor and yeoman agriculture and through the realities of corporate capitalism." And I think that it's a nice, vivid description in terms of the actual pull, because the actual tensions. I believe my work on the Comstock Lode explores the diverse and dynamic relationships generated by the interplay between these ideologies and economic forces. But this greater reconstruction was both physical and environmental as much as it was economic, cultural, and political. Although northwestern Nevada remained on the geographic periphery of the nation and continues to occupy the analytic periphery of existing historiography, what transpired there from 1859 through the 1880s reflected core changes transforming the country during and after the Civil War. Immigration, industrialization, the expansion of corporations, and the construction of railroads all helped spur the rapid growth of new communities and integrate the North American West into a nation reconstructing its disparate regions into a more unified whole. The Comstock's two main towns, Virginia City and Gold Hill, became foundational nodes in the emergence and proliferation of these larger structural forces. As much as the vast quantities of silver and gold found there, the Comstock's austere desert surroundings and dynamic underground environments explain its sudden and forceful impact on American history. Subterranean environmental forces created the Comstock's mineral wealth. They also shaped the hazardous and expensive working environments that corporations and miners constructed but could not fully control. The Comstock's most compelling historical reality has not received adequate attention from historians: the diverse ways that nature both shaped and was transformed by industrialization and the expansion of the corporation. Ultimately, the environmental history of the Comstock supports the contention of historian David Igler that, quote, "nature impacted the corporation as much as the corporation shaped its natural surroundings." The same may be said about the history of labor. Thomas Andrews' Killing for Coal and Gunther Peck's article, The Nature of Labor, have both done a fine job of exploring relationships between dynamic environments and the workers who built and labored in them. The Comstock Lode's history provides an ideal opportunity to combine the insights offered by these historians, as well as Professor West, to reveal how nature shaped not only working environments and occupational hazards, but to illuminate the ways dangerous and expensive subterranean obstacles contributed to the parallel rise of unions and corporations as part of this greater reconstruction in the United States, which is typically associated with industrialization in the Midwest and the Northeast. Corporations, workers, and machines constructed new underground environments that strained the reach of technical innovation, human endurance, and financial solvency. In its first 2 years of development, investors in the Comstock formed 86 mining corporations capitalized in the aggregate at more than $61 million. In 1862, these same people helped establish the San Francisco Stock Exchange precisely to meet demand for sales of Comstock stock. Over the next 2 decades, more than 100 Comstock companies taken together sold millions of shares of stock to people living in California, yes, Nevada, of course, but New York and London and all over the world. And they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into these mines. But aside from a small group, very few of them actually reaped profits. The growth of speculative investments and the proliferation of corporations and expanding industries signaled the beginning of larger trends that would continue to reshape the American economy swiftly over the next 2 generations. So how did subterranean environments contribute to the rapid expansion of technological systems and the rise of corporations and unions. Well, as the largest silver strike in the history of the United States and the nation's most dangerous mining district from 1860 to 1880, the Comstock lode proved hard rock mining's earliest industrial crucible in the American West. Flooding, fierce heat, shifting rocks, and immense depths increasingly drove the rapid innovation of new technologies and made the Comstock lode a laboratory for modern industrialism. By transforming inhospitable alien spaces into habitable work zones, mining companies encouraged the implementation of more capital-intensive technological systems to surmount ever more extreme environmental conditions. And the scale of these hazards and the expenses incurred in surmounting them further amplify the unparalleled advantages of corporations to overcome the physical constraints more rapidly than other forms of business organization possibly could. Due to the number of miners needed and the prevailing wage of $4 per day, labor quickly became the most expensive cost of doing business on the Comstock. In 1860 alone, nearly 2,000 miners already worked the lode. The number of miners peaked in 1875 at more than 4,900. The same volatile environmental forces of heat, water, explosions, and shifting and falling rock that made mining so expensive for the corporations made them very dangerous for the workers. Dangerous and taxing working conditions fatigued miners rapidly, which in turn lowered productivity and caused more accidents and illness. So, in order to prevent delays in extraction and expansion, companies tried to minimize danger and maximize worker productivity by employing more men on more shifts. And they made the transition to 3 rotating shifts of 8 hours as opposed to 2 12-hour shifts. Not immediately, but by the 1870s. Unusually high wages won through organization and fiercely protected by white workers whose success relied on both inter-ethnic cooperation and racist exclusion. The Irish and the Cornish, who represented roughly 2/3 of the workforce, subordinated their mutual enmity to the twin threats of occupational hazards and the prospect of cheap Chinese labor. The high wages on the Comstock were most explicitly wages of whiteness. Miners thus literally and figuratively embodied the tensions between risk and reward, as well as the economic and racial dimensions of stratified opportunities in an emerging corporate order. Although scores of corporations failed to deliver profits to their shareholders, they nevertheless contributed to the expansion of an industrialized business paradigm and the creation of working environments that would soon dominate mining. And as Richard White argues in Railroaded, the many financial failures of corporations during the second half of the 19th century were equally, if not more important than their alleged achievements that so transformed American society. Investors in the Comstock certainly succeeded in expanding the use of the corporate form at an explosive rate, even if most of them failed to make money in the process. Okay, so that's mine, and then some comments. In thinking of Rob's presentation, I'm struck by, I was immediately thinking of these twin forces of coal and railroads, which are obviously very well established in how they help reconstruct the nation in many ways, but also in terms of real and imagined and reimagined geographies. And more than anything, what I was struck by was the kind of process whereby the 5 civilized tribes become an impediment because they're so successful the first time. And now they're an impediment again because they're so successful in assimilating many of the aspects of white capitalism, right? And in protecting their boundaries fiercely, because they've already been burnt once, and they want to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so it's a fascinating example of the Reconstruction before the period that we're talking about in the Southeast with Indian removal, and then this broader period of Reconstruction where you have these railroads. And as he says, it's fascinating because you have the railroads kind of circling literally around before they can push through, right? Catharine Franklin, she has, I think, the most explicit example of these geographic connections because she has the officers themselves and the troops moving around the country. And pardon the pun, her sharper focus helps illuminate the tighter connections between the South and the West, where the military signified conquest, but were obligated to limit the excesses of that conquest in the West, while in the South they were attempting to enforce emerging laws and protect freedmen who were being granted new rights at that time, right? So this is, I think, the most explicit example. Jen Brown's work is fascinating because of the metaphors and the symbols going on here. This kind of real and reimagined region, and the Rocky Mountains in many ways to people in the East is still that place where you go to play, right? You go to hunt and fish and hike and ski. And part of this process is the introduction of non-natives, whether troops or trout. And it's appropriate that they're both involved in the reconstruction of Anglo-American masculinity in the 19th century, and it's even more appropriate that the people who are writing these things are military men, because who better to represent the reconstruction of Anglo-American masculinity during this period of time? Okay. And then Mark's stuff is interesting because he's talking about the reconstruction of maritime space and the reconstruction of commercial relationships. New York, Savannah, and Jacksonville, as well as apparently Sweden and elsewhere, and London, and the kind of expanding grip of commerce on this place, and that it is somewhat exceptional in the South because of its maritime space, right? And you said it's Texas and the foreign-born and all these different things. And the thing that I was struck by, which was a kind of a good symbol of this process, was the alligator skins and the fact that they're being exported, right? Because they're being exported because it's this exotic symbol that you can have something made out of alligator skin, but the very availability of this exotic commodity demonstrates something about how things are becoming that much less exotic, right, during this kind of domestication and settlement of this particular place, and how it's all kind of being reconstructed into these larger markets. So yeah, I guess I would end there. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We've had papers on Indians, railroads, soldiers, maritime nexus, mining, and trout fishing. Everything that ever happened in the West in the 19th century we've touched on. I hope we have time. We have plenty of time for some questions here, and I hope you all have some questions. I would like to just make a couple of very brief comments. What strikes me listening to these papers, first of all, is the theme of when you look closer at what's going on in the West, and specifically when you think of that in terms of what's parallel experiences of West and South, how often we see these figures who are sort of cliched figures in both regions, and the histories of both of the regions, playing very unexpected roles. We have Indians from the 5 civilized tribes serving, in effect, as sort of facilitating strike breakers, right, in coal mining. Who knew? We have soldiers out of the Black Hills and elsewhere in the West playing a role not as sort of the villainous characters of Dances with Wolves, but in fact who are in this very ambivalent and tricky position of trying to protect Indians from the invading whites. We have soldiers in the West, in the case of Jen Brown's paper, acting as boosters, as people who are trying to promote tourism and who are sort of creating sort of this new image of the West. West as a sportsman's paradise. None of this fits anywhere in the traditional way that we've been looking at the West and the South during these years. So I think what we can see here in these panels, there are other examples, as well as connections, wonderful connections. I think Robert made the excellent point about the gator skins. The first thing I was thinking of when you were going through that was bison. It's the same thing, where we have bison roes being sold in the East and in Europe, exactly because of their exoticism, because they're associated with this thing, but they're available, and they're being killed, and they're being transported and being marketed by this emergence of a new global market capitalist economy. So the delicious parallels that are involved here, I think, are quite fetching to me. East. I've got specific questions about some of these papers, but we'll open it up at this point and see if there are any questions here from the audience. We've got plenty of time, so take your time. Sir.
I had, I guess a bit inchoate, but just listening to the papers, which were all very interesting, and the comments, which are very helpful too, is that, so, of course, the term greater Reconstruction, I think, is now well established as they know, but, and I'm all for having a very open discussion about what Reconstruction was, really, anyways, what it meant, what the term meant at the time, things like that. But I do wonder more about the South and what is the relevance of what's going on in East Kentucky. Florida's a little easier, but what do they say even indirectly about the South and Reconstruction? One of the things that I was thinking of was that all of the papers seem to be about elements of capital, of global economy. And the ways in which that those spaces, and I think especially the first paper, opened up space for people to capitalism, and in a way we don't think of it this way, opened up all sorts of spaces for people to do things that by the racial hierarchy at the time they might not have expected to have been able to do. And is there some sort of implication of that for how we think of Reconstruction in the South and its relationship to capitalism? I don't know, it's a very open-ended and meandering question, I know, but I just kind of wondered if, there was something there in terms of what happens in the South.
That is a big question.
Yeah, I know.
It's a big question. Well, in my, so this comes out of my dissertation work that looks at, excuse me, the relationship of Native America, and I did not come at this as a Native American historian. I came at this as a historian of railroads. And so thinking about the space of this place and this term for the Indian Territory, it upends, like Dr. West was saying, it upends the standard narrative, where you have many Native Americans choosing to try and do what they can to invest in their livelihood, to make as much money as they possibly can, and yet at the same time, the part that I didn't get into is that you have many Native Americans who are resisting the inclusion of their space into the rest of America, and so there's tensions within the Indian nations themselves of who is a real Indian, and I choose in my own work to let people self-describe themselves. If somebody's claiming to be Native American, I let them. I use that terminology and let them stand there on their own. The other aspect that comes into the story that I didn't get into is the strike breakers that the Native Americans bring in. Well, there are two parts here. One is that some of the Native Americans who owned these, or who were landowners, were actually former slaves of Native Americans. So you have black Native Americans owning mines, bringing in white miners, right? Letting this sink in, right? And I was really trying to digest this doing my research. Not that it happened very often, and we're talking about several hundred mines. We're not talking about thousands upon thousands. But these are not, and they're not necessarily surface mines. They actually require capital. They're going into the earth and mining. But also the strike breakers that are brought in are African Americans to break the strike of 1894. And then to lead into Catharine's work, the other group that Native Americans call in to break the strike is the U.S. Army. Again, throwing this upside down. Here are Native Americans asking for the U.S. Army to protect them from whites, and then to evict these whites who were on strike. And then, the Native Americans retained control over their territory, so they gave literally individual passes for whites into their region. It wasn't open to settlement. Many people, of course, broke these rules, but in order to be there legally, you had to have a pass. The miners who were striking, their passes were revoked, and then they didn't go anywhere, so the Army was called in to evict Native Americans. Afterwards, the Army doesn't leave. They evict Native Americans and then stay there to protect the Indians, ending the Native control, Native sovereignty over their space. And there's, read the book when it comes out. There's a lot to be said here. These multiple layers of different, of a contrary narrative than what we're expecting. So, and how it relates to the South and Reconstruction, I'm still working on how it relates to a larger part of the Southern space. As a Californian, investigating Southern identity and what does Reconstruction mean, it's a bit of a stretch. Has been a bit of a stretch for me to work through this. So.
I'd like to, if I could, because I work on the South. But in some ways, I think that Florida is offers is a foil to what's playing out in other parts of the South. And there's in the rest of the manuscript, I talk a lot about, specifically about the sort of politics of Reconstruction. And Florida is, the peninsula of Florida anyway, because it's unsettled, becomes a target for a lot of northern activists. They want to turn it into their vision of what a reconstructed South should look like, right? So we have people like Harry Beecher Stowe, who buys a house, who buys an orange plantation in Florida just south of Jacksonville in a town called Mandarin, and a number of her relatives and friends and people that she had worked with before the war who moved to Florida, some volunteering with the Freedmen's Bureau, others simply just setting up residence and trying to create a kind of free labor vision, right? Sort of pre-war Republican free labor vision in Florida. That is essentially contested, of course, by Floridians, right? By the natives who were there for the most part. David Beverly writes that there's the repressed plan of Reconstruction is a kind of fee simple land ownership for freedmen, and in Florida this is a possibility because it is mostly unsettled. There's a Southern Homestead Act which would allow folks to move down and settle up land for very little. And that plan doesn't really go anywhere. I mean, it's a plan that's literally sort of washed over by the waves of the capital that I was talking about today. And I think for me, what's interesting about this is that I think what happens is that in this part of Florida, at least Peninsula Florida, the New South is constructed right away. I mean, beginning in 1870, the model that's being developed in Florida becomes what we think of as the New South some decades on, right? They're too busy to hate already from 1870. But it stands in sharp contrast, and it's a blank canvas in some ways, so that's easier to do. But the power of capital, right, the power of these markets is much stronger in some ways than the power of the state to try and certainly in this case the state of Florida try and sort of determine what's happening on the ground. That's not possible in Alabama and Mississippi and elsewhere. So I think it's a foil at best.
Yeah, what else? Strikes me that perhaps each of those two regions during the Reconstruction period and after, turning to leisure and to tourism as a way out of this. Perhaps that's a parallel that is both. Thinking of the two papers on trout fishing, and then in gator skinning, that seems to be one way, and it's kind of an interesting idea. It's not something we normally think would place at the top of the list of important things going on in both the West and the South, but they are two. It is an area that is getting increasing attention among historians in both of those fields. A recent dissertation I read by a very good young historian at Penn State on environment and land policy in the South and the New South places a great deal of emphasis on trying to create the South as a sort of a tourist mecca for Northerners. There's a book called The Tropics of Hope. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. That very explicitly talks about California and Florida, as I remember. I haven't read it carefully, but I've got it on my desk at home. So perhaps that's something that we could pay more attention to. It's especially interesting, it seems to me, because it's a kind of slightly more benign colonialism what they're both saying is, all you Northeasterners, use the South and use the West in this way for your purposes. To go out there and catch trout or sit on the beach or eat oranges or something. But very good question.
Tropics of Hope.
Tropics of, is that it?
I think it's, yeah.
David Long, yeah, Tropics of Hope. Yeah, very interesting. Questions and comments? Yes, ma'am.
This is much more trivial, but I'm curious about those Swedes in Florida. How did they get there, and how did
We love
they?
the Swedes.
How did they do?
Well, it's yes, good question. How they did is a very interesting story,
Yeah.
which I published in a collection of essays. But in short, the river giveth and the river taketh away. Right. So they got there. They were promised something other than what they found. They were told they would go to a booming city and a garden, and what they found was a howling wilderness that needed backbreaking labor. They were literally, as described in the archives, right? They were grubbing up palmetto stumps in order to place, to then build an orange grove. Just a horrific labor, which, like I said, local, maybe I didn't say, but they hired local whites who left very quickly because they had alternatives, and they brought African Americans in from the Georgia border who left very quickly because they had alternatives. And so they wanted fixed labor, and so the indentured servitude was the answer, right? Because they needed to fix it in place. The previous regime for fixed labor having been removed. So they run away. They don't run away, they sail away, is what they do. Upriver, they, in great numbers, they, for the most part, flee. After some short time, they go on strike. There's a second set of Swedes that come in the next year. They go on strike. It doesn't work out for Henry Sanford at all. There is an underground railroad on the St. Johns River. There's a safe house in Jacksonville. There's a safe house in Charleston, both owned by Swedes. They would stow away on the steamboats and make their way to the first safe house and then to a second safe house. Needless to say, Sanford's political opponents in Florida made great hay of this vision of this sort of Yankee capitalist who has these runaway, indentured servants in the Underground Railroad. So, yeah.
Swedes fleeing north on the Underground.
Swedes fleeing north. And just in a great irony, I think, and I can't nail this down, but it seems to be African American workers on the steamboats who are in fact giving them safe passage on the steamboats north, right? So,
That's fascinating.
yeah.
Where did they end up?
Well,
Are they
Upper Peninsula of
communities?
Michigan.
Some stay. They don't all leave. And then actually a third wave comes in the 1880s, not as indentured servants at this point, and they form a town called New Uppsala, which is just outside of Sanford. So there's a Swede town outside of Sanford and a town called Goldsboro, which is an African American town just outside of Sanford, which is dates at about the same time as Eatonville, which is close by, which you may know from Zora Neale Hurston. It was the first incorporated all black town in the South. Right, so there are these sort of towns that are built outside of the political lines of Sanford itself. But beyond that, I don't know. When they leave Sanford, I lose them. I can't find them. So I'm
They
not
don't
sure.
want to be found.
They don't want to be found. There's a reason they don't want to be found.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Yes, sir.
I have another question for Mark. Henry Sanford, as diplomat to Belgium, correct?
Mhm.
What was he trying to secure measure-wise from Chester A. Arthur for Belgium? It sounds like he's also acting kind of as an agent
Yes.
for Belgium, not only for the U.S., but also vice versa. And
He's a complicated man.
and I was wondering what he was trying to get for the Belgian government as far as the Congo is concerned, or were you able to go into the details?
Sure,
in
yeah.
that, or, yeah.
And what he's trying to get is the United States to basically sign off on what Leopold's doing in the Congo, because there's a great deal of resistance, right? So Henry Sanford has clearly gone native, right? He's a diplomat who he owns, as a result of smoothing the way to keep the U.S. from, there's an international convention on the Congo in which Leopold sort of orchestrates this international convention to try and window dress what's happening in the Congo. Henry Sanford's there, and the United States functionally, remains more neutral. It's not an active participation on the U.S., but does not condemn what Leopold's doing in this period. What Sanford gets out of it is a business opportunity in In the Congo, he is granted a monopoly rights to steamboat traffic on Lake Victoria as a result, right? He runs this for a while. Like everything he runs it into the ground. He loses money hand over fist. He lives a very elaborate lifestyle in Brussels. He has the biggest house and finest carriage, etc. So he needs money, and he can't seem to make it.
Jim, you said that the time you were talking about, initially 40% of the streams in the Yellowstone
Right.
had no fish?
Yeah, and a lot of the lakes and the streams, just the way the geography was, plus the hot springs coming out.
Oh,
Um,
but they could support the fish once they were stocked?
Yeah, yeah. And so now most of the non-native fish in Yellowstone are self-supporting. They don't stock them anymore. They haven't for years and years. But and so the winter fishing in some parts of the park is better because it's not iced over.
All right.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could piggyback on that real quick, because I was actually kind of curious. I mean, I don't know much about, the history of fishing as a form of environmental history. And I think of, like, the stuff I do know, I think of, like, fishing in colonial America and the idea of a common kind of public resource and how that changes over time. But I was just kind of curious about how capitalist is the ethos surrounding this behavior that people are doing, and then how far back does the history go of stocking streams, ponds, or anything like that for kind of, I guess you'd say, touristy purposes? Is this like the first instance of people doing things like this? So I was just kind of curious.
Well, no. I mean, fish culture of like keeping fish in ponds to eat, or even moving them from pond to pond, dates back to Rome, China, those types of places. Using hatcheries and the artificial reproduction of fish, which is kind of what we're talking about here, and then most of the trout are shipped out on railroads. Some of them come out other ways. That dates to the 19th century, and that's a technology that originated in France and then spread throughout Europe, the United States, and then the world. And there's a article by Darren Kinsey in Environmental History about kind of the French origins of fish culture. So that's kind of more recent 19th century. And it's also needed, steam transportation's needed within all that. Otherwise, the fish will die, especially trout are a little harder to propagate in hatcheries and ship long distances because they need cold water and they need aerated, oxygenized water within all that. Yeah.
If you want a good, quick read, I actually teach it for my environmental history class. It's called An Entirely Synthetic Fish by Anders Halvorsen. It's an eminently readable history book written by a scientist, a conservation fish biologist. And he talks all about, he doesn't stay in one spot for any long amount of time. He talks about the origins of hatchery culture and conservation and planting and stocking fish and problems. And so.
I'm sure there's a joke in here about this little Swedish fish.
You said it.
I said, it hadn't occurred to me. Excellent.
Yeah, I had a question for Dr. Braun as well. It seems that the officers in your narrative are trying to construct angling as this sport for these kind of elite men, this very masculine domain. Did you find any evidence of women in your story as you were researching?
That's my plant in the audience, by the way. Although I did not know she was going to ask that question. No, that's a good question. So this brings me back to your question about the South and what's going on, and then your comment about leisure remaking the South and the West, which I think is interesting because in the greater Reconstruction time period, the goal is to assimilate people, assimilate the freed people, assimilate the Native Americans. The goal increasingly in kind of the rise of sport and leisure is to exclude people, exclude other races, exclude other classes within all that. But what's interesting, you mentioned Anglo-American masculinities as part of that for fly fishing particularly, women are welcomed into the sport. It's one of the few kind of sports where it's a respectable sport for women. You have to wear, you know, the dress and the shoes and kind of maintain those gender boundaries, but it's increasingly women are taking up the sport of fly fishing in the 19th century in British America. And so what the anglers do here, and why I come back to your question, is that they're starting to use gender to redefine leisure and exclusion. So you have men using gender and this idea of masculinity to uphold their masculinity over kind of the immigrants, working class, other races, that sort of thing. But you also have the use of femininity in many ways. That's how they remake fishing into a leisure sport. It's a middle class identity within all of that, and so it's upheld as kind of white middle class, increasingly excluding those people that are supposed to be assimilated during this time period.
I have a follow-up question on that, because Halverson and others have talked about why trout, and why, because trout are smart, they're hard to catch, and it shows how smart Anglo men are. They don't want to catch carp like somebody from Southern or Eastern Europe, because that's not a challenge, right? And so is there a discourse about, is anybody writing about what it's appropriate for women to catch other than trout, or is it simply about class?
Well, you know, that's interesting. So I kind of address this a little bit in my larger work, is coarse fish, which is anything besides trout and salmon, is now starting to be connected to all these lower races and classes, but also to women and children. Because coarse fish, carp, all the kind of little bait fishes, other species are a little easier to catch. And so you have some people sporting writers in the time period starting to connect them to women and children, and then some not. So it kind of depends on the writer.
But it's a little muddled why.
Yeah. It's silly ideas of species and fish within all of that.
Did you want to ask some of your questions that you had, or?
I was curious about the fish there. I was curious, you already answered mine. That is who these workers were, where they came from, who the strike breakers were. In other words, breaking that down demographically, that made me curious.
Sure.
I was certainly curious about the alligator skin trade.
It plays out quickly, I'll tell you that.
What is it?
When Chester Arthur makes his trip in 1883, the New York Times reporters are complaining they didn't see an alligator until they got to Lake Monroe, which is 200 miles of river channel. They didn't see a single alligator.
We'll see lots of them now.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to comment on, for fishing, for the Indian Territory, the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad sends out brochures to trying to entice travelers. They say travelers, they mean settlers. In their appeals, you can tell that they're not asking for people to just, come visit. Although the Missouri, Kansas, Texas has no rights of access to anything beyond 100-foot wide swath through the Indian Territory. That's the access they have, 100 feet wide. But in many brochures, they advertise, come to the Indian Territory to go fishing, and don't go all the way to Yellowstone. Don't go all the way to the Rockies. You can get pristine and perfect, undamaged terrain here because it's just been Indians all along, which means it's all natural. Right? It's undisturbed. It's natural. So, although nothing about masculinity from that brief recollection, it didn't work itself into, that information didn't work its way into my work, but at the same time you have railroads appealing for fishermen and to appeal to the sporting lifestyle, trying to get those anglers out there and to use the space, and then eventually maybe you'll stay and export your fish on our railroad, or grow wheat or come mine or something along those lines once the land opens. So
now I want to know if the 5 civilized tribes had trout farms.
No, as far as I know, they didn't. But I haven't looked at that. But not yet.
One question occurred to me. Thinking about Mark's presentation, about this whole idea of a maritime nexus and how this really led to a very different story, sort of an isolated or distinct story of the Jacksonville area as compared to the rest of the South, and in particular, sort of an accelerated development and change. Are there parallels of that in the West? In the West, we think almost immediately, of course, of the railroad, of wagon roads to an extent. Government surveyed and developed wagon roads. River transport to a point, but are there instances in the West of that kind of phenomenon? And I think there might be, for all of the stress that we have on the arid West. I'm thinking in particular of the Columbia Basin, the so-called Palouse country, which in the 1870 census, has this fascinating map that shows wheat production across the United States, and it shows it color-coded by or patterned by efficiency, meaning the most modern ways of producing wheat, which boils down to the least amount of labor per land. In other words, the areas that are the largest pieces of land that are farmed with, that has the highest production and the lowest labor, those are class 4. It starts with class 1, which is the most inefficient, all the way up to class 4. And the West has 3 of these. There's only one in the East. It's in Minnesota, of the highest level. The West has 3 or 4. One of them is the Central Valley of California, which is connected through San Francisco in the river system there, and another one's in Salt Lake City. That's not going to work. But the other one is in the Columbia Basin. The wheat develops there because the Columbia is even with the problems of the bar, it has this maritime connection. So maybe that's one thing to be one parallel between South and West. Look for those kinds of that kind of pattern. It's not something that I associate, frankly, with development, but I think that we ought to perhaps look more into to look for that phenomenon.
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up, because in thinking about it in maritime, because Richard in Railroad, it talks about how they have to keep buying the steamboat companies because it's so much cheaper to ship wheat, even with the railroads, right? And they're just scrambling to make money and eliminate their competitors.
Yeah, you all read the railroad. Makes a fascinating point where railroads are buying space on steamships so it won't be used by other competitors. So they will have to use the railroads. And the larger point, of course, is this maritime connection is pretty good.
It's too viable.
It's pretty useful. Yeah, it's a very interesting connection. Any other questions? We've got. Well, we did have 2 minutes. We don't need more. It's 3:20. So thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it. And thanks.
Thank you.